That neat pour you're so proud of. It's quietly hiding most of what your bottle is actually capable of, and 3 drops of water unlock the rest. The whiskey snobs who roll their eyes at a splash of water are costing themselves the best part of every dram they own. I'm talking about flavor compounds locked behind a wall of ethanol, aromatic molecules pinned. To the bottom of the glass, finishes cut short by their own alcohol burn. The bottle you spent $60, $80, $200 on is performing at maybe 60% of its potential. There's actual peer-reviewed chemistry behind why a few drops change everything, and by the end of this, we'll get to the one bottle in my collection that taught me I'd been drinking whiskey wrong for a decade, plus the single piece of glassware that does most of this heavy lifting for you, almost for free. Let me start with the science, because once you understand what's happening at the molecular level inside that glass, you'll never argue about it again. In 2017, research published in Scientific Reports by a team at Linköping University in Sweden examined what happens to whiskey when water is added. Scientific Reports is part of the Nature publishing family, peer-reviewed, not a brand-funded marketing study. The researchers focused on a compound called guaiacol, responsible for much of the smoky, peaty, slightly medicinal aroma that defines whiskeys aged in charred barrels. Guaiacol is what your nose registers before your tongue knows what's coming. It's the perfumed signature of the dram. The team used computational chemistry, molecular simulations, to look at where guaiacol sits inside a glass at varying alcohol concentrations. Here's what their simulation suggested. In a glass of whiskey, at cask strength, around 59 to 60% alcohol by volume, guaiacol molecules tend to gather away from the surface, deeper in the liquid, trapped. They're held there by the way ethanol and water interact at high concentrations. But when you dilute the whiskey down to roughly 45% alcohol or below, the modeled behavior shifted. The guaiacol migrated upward, toward the surface, where it could evaporate into the headspace and reach your nose. At cask strength, half the aroma is hiding. At drinking strength, it floats up to greet you. Master blenders at every major Scotch distillery taste at around 20% ABV when they're nosing samples, sometimes lower. They cut their whiskey in half because that's the concentration where the molecules behave the way they need them to behave to actually evaluate the spirit. If the people who make whiskey for a living drink it watered down at work, you can stop pretending you're insulting the distiller by adding a few drops at home. There's another piece worth understanding. Surface tension. Research suggests ethanol and water form clusters at the molecular level, microscopic groupings organized around hydrogen bonds, and those clusters change shape based on the ratio between them. At high alcohol concentrations, ethanol molecules dominate the perimeter of the glass, surrounding the flavor compounds and pinning them in place. Drop the alcohol percentage, and water molecules elbow their way in, breaking the ethanol grip and freeing the aromatics to drift upward. Guaiacol behaves like a hydrophobic guest at a water-heavy party. At high ABV, it clings to ethanol clusters and sinks. At lower ABV, surface tension dynamics push it toward the air-liquid boundary. That boundary is where evaporation happens. That evaporation is what your nose receives as aroma. Esters tell a similar story. Esters are the fruity, floral, sometimes confectionery aromas in whiskey: pear, apple skin, banana, honey, rose petal. And research suggests they're particularly sensitive to alcohol concentration in the headspace. At cask strength, the more delicate ethyl esters can be masked entirely by evaporating ethanol, fighting them for olfactory real estate. Bring the ABV down, and those esters get a clear runway. Tasters consistently report that fruit notes seem to appear after dilution, when in reality those notes were always present. Phenols, the smoky compounds in peated whiskies, follow the same arc. Aldehydes, which carry grassy and nutty character, behave a third way. Research suggests the alcohol-water cluster theory offers a working model for what's happening below the surface. Ethanol molecules and water molecules don't sit side by side as a uniform mixture. They group into transient pockets that shrink, expand, and rearrange themselves based on overall concentration. At high ABV, ethanol-rich pockets dominate, trapping flavor compounds inside them. At lower ABV, the water-rich regions take over, squeezing the ethanol pockets smaller and forcing the flavor compounds out into the open. For most cask strength whiskies, the sweet spot lives between 40 and 46% ABV in the glass. For barrel-proof bourbons sitting at 65% out of the bottle, you might need close to a teaspoon of water per ounce of pour. For a 43% single malt, you might need nothing at all. A quick story. The bottle that converted me was a sample of Glenfarclas 105, poured neat at a friend's house years ago. I sipped it, made a face I'm not proud of, and told him politely I didn't get the appeal. He laughed, took my glass, dropped in maybe 4 drops of water from a pipette, handed it back, and told me to wait 30 seconds. It was a different whiskey. Sherry, dark fruit, soft smoke, all where there had been only heat. That's when I stopped arguing about water. So what actually happens in the glass? 3 things in sequence. First, the nose opens up. Vanilla buried under alcohol heat suddenly becomes obvious. Fruit notes, dried apricot, baked apple, candied orange peel. Push forward. Smoke softens. The harsh ethanol burn backs off. I poured a Stagg Junior at full strength last year and got mostly alcohol fumes. 3 drops of water later, the same glass smelled like maple syrup, dark cherry and tobacco leaf. Same liquid, different planet. Second, the palate widens. With less ethanol biting at your tongue, your taste buds can actually do their job. Subtle savory notes, leather, dark chocolate, espresso, charred oak, emerge from behind the alcohol curtain. A whiskey that felt sharp can become rounder, almost creamy. Third, the finish lengthens. Logic says diluted whiskey should fade faster. The opposite tends to happen. Because the alcohol is no longer numbing your palate as quickly, the lingering flavors have time to develop. A finish that ran 6 seconds neat can run 20 seconds with water. How do you actually do this? Drops, not splashes. A pipette, an eyedropper, even a clean spoon. Start with 2 or 3 drops in a 1 ounce pour. Nose. Sip. If it still feels closed off, add 2 or 3 more. You can always add water. You cannot remove it. Use room temperature water, ideally still and filtered. No ice. Ice chills the spirit, suppressing aromatic compounds rather than releasing them. Spring water or filtered water at room temperature is the answer. Wait 30 seconds after adding water before you nose the glass again. The molecules need a moment to redistribute. The amount of water in a meaningful adjustment is shockingly small. 3 to 10 drops in a 1 ounce pour for most cask strength bottles. Roughly a 1/4 teaspoon at most. The volume is negligible. The chemical impact is enormous. Now let's talk about specific bottles. Booker's, the cask strength bourbon from Beam Suntory, lands between 62 and 64% ABV, roughly 124 to 128 proof. At $80 to $90 in most US markets, neat it can feel like punishment. The first nose registers as solvent and alcohol fumes with a faint suggestion of caramel pinned underneath. 3 to 5 drops of water and you suddenly find layered toffee, dark fruit, charred barrel, walnut shell, brown sugar crust, and a finish that runs minutes long with cocoa and warm cinnamon trailing behind. Same bottle, same pour, different drink entirely. In my assessment, anyone drinking Booker's Neat is leaving most of the experience on the table. Stagg Junior, now branded simply as Stagg in recent batches, comes from Buffalo Trace, $60 to $70 at MSRP, bottled at varying barrel proofs, often pushing 65% ABV. Recent releases have hit 132 proof. Drinking Stagg Neat is like trying to listen to a symphony through a closed door. The first sip arrives as a wall of pepper and ethanol. Add water, about a teaspoon for a generous pour, and the door swings open. Brown sugar, dark cherry, baking spice, leather, espresso bean, dark molasses, and that Buffalo Trace mineral earthiness all come forward in distinct layers. The texture turns from sharp to dense and chewy. The finish stretches for a small eternity, leaving stewed plum and pipe tobacco echoing for 30, 40, even 50 seconds. Aberlour A'bunadh, the cask strength sherry bomb single malt from Speyside, costs around $80 to $100, and arrives at roughly 60% ABV, 118 to 122 proof, with batch numbers printed on each label. Neat, it's almost overwhelming, with sherry sweetness and alcohol heat fighting each other. The nose feels syrupy and singed at the same time. With a few drops, the dried fig, raisin, hazelnut, dark chocolate, oloroso depth, candied orange peel, and a faint whiff of beeswax, all separate and become individually identifiable. The texture softens from sticky hot to plush. Tasters consistently report the sherry character resolving from a single overwhelming impression into a series of distinct, identifiable notes. Glenfarclas 105 sits at 57% ABV, 114 proof, and runs $60 to $75. The family-owned Glenfarclas distillery has refused to chase trends or marketing budgets for generations. Neat, the nose offers heavy sherry behind an alcohol veil. The first sip is hot and tannic. Add water and you get sherry cask elegance, Christmas cake, marmalade, soft smoke, almond paste, beeswax, dried apricot, and a delicate cocoa edge. The texture goes from astringent to round and almost honeyed. The finish carries toasted nut and clove out for half a minute. This is the bottle that converted me. Wild Turkey Rare Breed, around $50 to $60, hovers near 58% ABV, generally 116 proof. One of the most consistently underpriced cask strength bourbons on shelves. Neat, the rye spice and oak char dominate, with a sharp pepper note that closes off the back of the throat. The sweetness is buried. A few drops and you find honey, vanilla custard, baked apple, toasted oak, a hint of orange peel, and a long, peppery finish that wouldn't be out of place on a bottle costing twice as much. The mouthfeel shifts from lean and fiery to coating and warm. Tasters consistently report that even long-time Wild Turkey skeptics come around once they try Rare Breed with 3 drops of water. Maker's Mark Cask. Strength, generally $70 to $80, ranges around 55 to 58% ABV. The standard maker's expression is famously approachable at 90 proof, but the cask strength version is a different beast, and rewards water more than almost any wheated bourbon I've tried. Neat, the wheat softness gets crushed under the alcohol weight, reading as hot and slightly chemical on the back end. Drops of water bring out caramelized banana, soft nutmeg, brown butter, toasted brioche, dried fig, and the wheat sweetness that defines the brand. The texture turns from heat forward to almost silky, with a buttery glide across the mid-palate. The finish reveals warm baking spice and a faint candied citrus note. There's a 6th bottle worth mentioning. Elijah Craig Barrel Proof from Heaven Hill comes out at varying batch strengths between 60 and 68% ABV, $60 to $70 at retail. Heaven Hill releases 3 batches a year. Neat, the high-proof batches can be searing. The nose dominated by alcohol vapor, the palate locked up under barrel char and tannin. Add water, start with 5 drops, and you find dense layers of dark caramel, charred oak, vanilla bean, baked stone fruit, milk chocolate, and a finish that holds for 30 seconds or more, with toasted pecan and warm cardamom riding underneath. But, and this matters, there are bottles where water is the wrong move. Lower proof whiskies sitting at 40 to 43% ABV are already at or near the dilution sweet spot. Adding water to a 40% bourbon will likely just thin out what's there. Standard Jim Beam White, Basic Jameson Original, Entry-Level Glenlivet 12. These benefit from a proper tasting glass and breathing time, not water. Push them lower, and the modest aromatics they do carry get diluted into nothing. Delicate aromatic bottles, light, floral single malts, certain lowland scotches like Auchentoshan, gentle grain whiskies, soft sherry-finished blends, can lose their signature character if you push them too far down. The blender already did the dilution math. Trust the work. Many Japanese whiskies, particularly the more delicate hibiki blends and certain Yamazaki expressions bottled around 43%, are crafted with the dilution already calibrated by the blender. The Japanese tradition often involves serving with a single large hand-cut ice ball, or as a highball with sparkling water. Same logic applies to many Irish single pot still whiskies and softer Speyside expressions. Adding water to a Hibiki Harmony or a Redbreast 12 will typically thin the silken texture without unlocking anything new. If you're not sure whether your bottle wants water, do a small split test. Pour a ½ ounce in one glass neat. Pour another ½ ounce in a second glass and add 2 drops. Wait a minute. Nose both. Sip both. Compare. If the watered glass smells flatter or weaker, you've got your answer. If it blooms with new aromas, you've found another bottle that benefits from the technique. Older single malts at standard strength fall into the same category. A 25-year-old Scotch bottled at 43% has been calibrated by a master blender across decades. Heavy-handed dilution will flatten everything the years build up. The rule is simple. Anything over 50% ABV is a candidate for water. Anything between 46 and 50 is your judgment call. Anything at or below 46%, leave alone unless something feels overtly closed off. Now here's the closing piece. There's one piece of glassware that does much of this work for you, and it costs less than a fast food combo meal. The Glencairn glass. Designed in Scotland in the early 2000s, in collaboration with master blenders from several major Scotch distilleries, the Glencairn is a tulip-shaped tasting glass with a narrow rim, a wide bowl, and a stubby base you can hold without warming the spirit too quickly. The shape concentrates aromas at the top, while allowing the whiskey to breathe in the bowl. A rocks glass disperses aromas across too wide an opening. A wine glass over-disperses them and lets the alcohol burn dominate the nose. A Glencairn focuses everything right where your nose meets the rim. Use a Glencairn, and a 46% bourbon will reveal nuances that the same bourbon poured in a tumbler will hide completely. Add 3 drops of water to a cask strength pour in a Glencairn, and you're in tasting room territory. The same kind of glass used in actual distillery sample evaluations across Scotland, Kentucky, and Japan. They run about $10 to $15 for a set of 2 or 4. There is no piece of whiskey gear with a better return on investment. Forget the rocks glass your uncle gave you. Forget the heavy crystal tumbler that looks impressive in a movie. The Glencairn was designed by people who taste whiskey for a living. The narrow rim does the engineering work. It captures rising volatile compounds, holds them in a tight column, and delivers them straight to your nostrils instead of letting them dissipate into the room. A short note on care. Wash your Glencairns by hand with warm water and a drop of unscented dish soap. Skip the dishwasher, which can leave detergent residue that hijacks every nose for the next month. Air dry them upside down on a clean rack. If you're hosting a tasting, line up 4 or 5 Glencairns side by side, each with a different pour, and let your guests work down the row with a few drops of water in each. That's how a distillery sample room works. Pair the Glencairn with a small pipette. Pharmacy plastic, $3 for a pack of 10. And you have everything you need to taste any whiskey on earth at its best. A glass and a dropper. The rest is patience and attention. One more thought. The water versus neat debate often gets framed as a question of taste preference, like one approach is correct and the other is heresy. That framing is wrong. A first sip neat tells you about the spirit's structure. A second sip with water tells you what's hiding underneath. Treat any cask strength bottle as a 2-part tasting, not a binary choice. So here's where I land. Stop guarding the bottle from yourself. Water is not an insult to the distiller. Most of them taste their own work cut down to 20%. The notion that a real whiskey drinker takes everything neat is a marketing fiction perpetuated by people who learned the hobby from movies and bar scenes. Real drinkers, the ones who taste hundreds of pours a year, almost all of them use water as a tool. They pour cask strength, they nose neat, they cut, they nose again. They sip, they think, and they decide what the bottle is actually doing. You spent good money on that bottle. Get all of it. 3 drops, 30 seconds, the right glass, and the whiskey. You thought you knew becomes a whiskey you've never actually met.